The battle for Railway Station No. 1 began on the 14th of September 1942 as part of the German assault into central Stalingrad. The 71st Infantry Division, attached to the 51st Army Corps of the 6th Army, received orders to secure the railway complex that dominated the city's transportation infrastructure. Over 3 days, German forces launched repeated assaults against Soviet defenders from the 1st Guards Army and 62nd Army, who had fortified the station's buildings and platforms. The station changed hands multiple times in a series of brutal close-quarters engagements that exemplified the ferocity of urban combat in Stalingrad. I was there. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich, 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, 191st Grenadier Regiment, 71st Infantry Division. We arrived in the outskirts of Stalingrad on the 12th of September after a march that destroyed our boots and whatever illusions we still carried from the summer campaign. The city sprawled before us like a carcass, already half consumed by fire and explosives. Smoke rose from 1,000 points, creating a permanent haze that turned the sun into a dim orange disk. The Volga stretched beyond, wide and indifferent. At night, we could see the flash of artillery on the far bank, the Soviets feeding reinforcements across while we tried to break their defenders street by street. Nobody told us the name of the operation or what the grand plan looked like. We knew the 6th Army was pushing into the city. We knew our division had orders to take the center. That was the extent of it. The rest arrived as fragments, rumors from other companies. An exhausted runner mentioning that 1st Battalion had reached the Tsaritsa River. A casualty being carried past, his leg gone below the knee, muttering about snipers in the grain elevator. We assembled pieces but never saw the whole picture. That was not our job. The terrain was rubble. Stalingrad before the war must have been a proper city, but by the time we arrived, it had been transformed into a landscape of shattered masonry and twisted metal. Buildings stood with their facades blown away, exposing staircases and rooms open to the sky. Cellars gaped like wounds. The streets were cratered from artillery and aerial bombardment, some craters large enough to hide a squad. Everything was covered in a fine grey dust that got into your lungs and never left. The smell was a mixture of burning wood, cordite, and something else, something organic and rotting that intensified in the September heat. On the 13th, we moved into assembly positions south of the railway complex. The station itself was a massive structure, or had been before the Luftwaffe worked it over. 2 long platforms ran parallel to the tracks, covered by a steel and concrete roof that now sagged in places where bombs had struck the supports. The main station building stood to the west, a 3-story administrative structure with columns across its front. Windows were blown out, walls were pocked with shell fragments, but the structure remained intact enough to provide cover, which meant the Soviets would defend it and we would have to take it. Hauptmann Fischer gathered the company officers and senior non-commissioned officers in a basement near the assembly area. He spread a map across a table, though the map was weeks out of date and showed streets that no longer existed. The station was marked clearly enough. Fischer explained that 2nd Battalion would attack from the south at dawn on the 14th. 3rd Company would take the left flank, moving along the western edge of the platforms toward the main building. 1st Company would advance on the right, securing the eastern platforms and the rail yards beyond. 4th Company would remain in reserve. He gave us the timeline. Artillery preparation would begin at 0500 hours. Stukas would hit the station at 0515. Infantry assault at 0530. We had 45 minutes to take the station before the Soviets could organize a counterattack. After that, all guarantees expired. Nobody asked questions. There was nothing to ask. The plan was simple because complicated plans died in contact with Stalingrad's rubble. You attacked. You closed with the enemy. You killed them, or they killed you. Everything else was decoration. We spent the night in a half-collapsed apartment building, trying to sleep while listening to Soviet patrols moving through the darkness. Some men wrote letters, others checked their equipment for the 5th or 10th time, a ritual that provided the illusion of control. I sat with my squad near a shattered window, watching the station's silhouette against the night sky. Occasionally we saw movement, shadows crossing between buildings. The Soviets knew we were coming. They always knew. Gefreiter Steiner smoked the last of his cigarettes. He offered me one, but I declined. My throat was already raw from the dust. Steiner had been with the company since Poland. He had survived France and the first year of the Eastern Front. He should have been a veteran, calm and controlled, but his hands shook as he lit each cigarette. We all saw it. Nobody mentioned it. Fear was universal in Stalingrad. Admitting it changed nothing. At 0400 hours, we moved to the jump-off positions. The darkness was absolute, broken only by distant fires and the occasional flare rising from Soviet positions. We lay in the rubble 60 meters from the station's perimeter, trying to stay low as Soviet machine gun fire swept the approaches at irregular intervals. The gunners were firing blind, hoping to catch movement, but the tracers marked their positions clearly. I made note of 3 locations. Second story of the main building, ground floor of the Eastern Platform building, a pile of concrete and steel that might have been a ticket booth. The waiting was worse than the attack. Minutes stretched, my stomach cramped from tension and from whatever disease had been spreading through the company for the past week. Half of us had dysentery. There were no medical supplies to treat it. You suffered and continued. Men voided their bowels in the rubble and stayed at their posts because leaving your position meant dying. At 0500 exactly, our artillery opened fire. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous rolling thunder that made thought impossible. Shells screamed overhead and detonated against the station building with flashes that lit the ruins. The Soviet machine guns fell silent. For 90 seconds we experienced hope, the naive belief that the bombardment might actually suppress the defenders. Then the Soviet guns resumed firing, and we understood that hope was a luxury we could not afford. The Stukas arrived at 0515, 3 of them diving out of the morning twilight with their sirens screaming. They released their bombs and climbed away while the explosions tore apart the Eastern Platform. Debris fountained into the air. A section of the roof collapsed with a groan of twisting metal. When the dust cleared, the Eastern Platform was a smoking ruin, but the main building stood untouched. That was where the Soviets were concentrated. That was where we would die. At 0530, Hauptmann Fischer blew his whistle. 3rd Company rose from the rubble and advanced. The Soviet defenders opened fire immediately. Machine gun rounds tore through the morning air with a sound like fabric ripping. Men fell. I saw Gefreiter Hartmann take 3 rounds across the chest and collapse without a sound. Obergefreiter Schmidt stumbled and fell, his leg shattered below the knee. He screamed for a medic, but there were no medics forward. We ran past him. There was no alternative. I threw myself behind a pile of brick and concrete 20 meters from the platform. My squad followed. We were 6 men. We'd been 12 that morning. The others were hit crossing open ground or were pinned down further back. I could not see them. I could not help them. I focused on what was in front of me. The platform stretched before us, a concrete structure elevated a meter above ground level. Soviet soldiers were firing from behind the cover of concrete pillars and collapsed sections of roof. I saw muzzle flashes. I aimed at them and fired back. Whether I hit anyone I could not tell. Combat in Stalingrad was not like the training grounds where targets fell when struck. Here you fired into smoke and dust and hoped the enemy died before you did. Steiner was beside me, his rifle firing in controlled bursts. His hands had stopped shaking. Combat did that. Fear evaporated in the adrenaline of action. You stopped thinking about death because thinking meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. You moved, you fired, you survived the next 10 seconds and worried about the 10 seconds after that. Hauptmann Fischer appeared at our position, moving in a crouch. He pointed toward the platform's western edge, where a gap in the Soviet line had opened. First squad had pushed through. We needed to exploit it before the Soviets reinforced. Fischer did not wait for acknowledgement. He moved forward and we followed because that was what soldiers did. Orders were simple. Execution was chaos. We reached the platform and climbed onto it, using rubble as steps. The fighting became immediate and brutal. Soviet soldiers were 10 meters away, 15 meters, some close enough to see their faces. Young men, old men, all of them desperate, and all of them trying to kill us. I shot a Soviet rifleman as he leaned around a pillar. He fell backward, his rifle clattering across concrete. Another Soviet appeared and threw a grenade. It landed between Steiner and me. I threw myself flat. The grenade detonated with a sharp crack that left my ears ringing. When I looked up, Steiner was gone. Just gone. Where he had been standing there was only blood and scattered equipment. We pushed forward, room by room through the platform buildings, offices, waiting rooms, storage areas. All of it gutted by fire and explosives, but still providing cover for defenders who fought from behind overturned furniture and piles of debris. The Soviet soldiers did not retreat in an organized manner. They fought until they died or until we killed them. Then we moved to the next room and repeated the process. By 0800 hours, 3rd Company had secured the western platform. 1st Company had taken the eastern platform despite the Stuka damage making the rubble nearly impassable. The main station building remained contested. Soviet defenders held the upper floors, while German infantry fought through the ground level. The fighting there was savage. Grenades thrown down stairwells. Automatic fire sprayed through doorways. Men bayoneted each other in corridors too narrow for rifles to swing freely. I entered the main building with what remained of my squad. We were 4 men now. Gefreiter Holzer, Gefreiter Baumann, Schütze Koch. All of us were wounded in small ways. Fragments embedded in flesh, burns from explosions, cuts from flying debris. Nothing serious enough to evacuate, nothing minor enough to ignore. We bled and fought and did not think about medical attention because there was none available. The ground floor was a hellscape. Bodies lay everywhere, German and Soviet mixed together. Some were intact, others were not. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, excrement, burned flesh. The human body opened in ways that training never prepared you for. You learned to step over corpses without looking down. You learned to ignore the wounded crying for help because helping them meant exposing yourself to fire. You learned to be something less than human because humanity was a liability. We cleared rooms systematically, throw a grenade, wait for the explosion, rush in firing, kill anything that moved, check the corners, move to the next room. The Soviets employed the same tactics. We met in a corridor on the building's south side. Both squads opened fire simultaneously. The sound in that enclosed space was deafening. Holzer went down with a throat wound, choking on his own blood. I shot the Soviet soldier who had killed him. Another Soviet soldier shot Baumann through the stomach. Baumann fell, clutching his abdomen, his intestines spilling between his fingers. He did not scream. He simply stared at his own body in disbelief. Koch and I retreated. There was no shame in it. The corridor was a killing ground. We fell back to a stairwell where Hauptmann Fischer had established a temporary command post. He was wounded. Blood soaked through a bandage wrapped around his left arm. He asked about the squad. I told him we had lost contact with the others. He nodded. It was an acceptable answer in Stalingrad. Units fragmented. Men disappeared. You reported what you could and moved forward. By midday, we controlled most of the station. Soviet resistance had collapsed or withdrawn to the upper floors. German infantry occupied the platforms, the rail yards, and the ground level of the main building. We established defensive positions and waited for orders. None came. Communications were erratic. Runners moved between positions, but half of them never arrived. The Soviets had snipers covering every approach. Moving in daylight was suicide. We ate cold rations in the ruins. There was no hot food, no coffee. We drank water from our canteens and prayed it would not give us dysentery, though it probably would. Some men slept. I could not. Adrenaline still coursed through my system, making my hands shake and my thoughts race. I sat with my back against a concrete pillar and watched the approaches, waiting for the Soviet counterattack that would inevitably come. It came at 1400 hours. Soviet infantry supported by a single tank, a 34 that appeared from the northern approach and began firing into the station at point-blank range. The first round detonated against a platform support, bringing down a section of roof that crushed 3 German soldiers. The second round hit the main building, blowing apart a room we had occupied minutes earlier. The tank's machine gun raked the platforms, forcing us into cover. Soviet infantry followed the tank, advancing in rushes between piles of rubble. They fired from the hip as they ran, not aiming, just suppressing. It was effective. We could not raise our heads to return fire without being cut down. The tank continued its advance, grinding over rubble and bodies, firing its main gun into any position that showed resistance. An Unteroffizier from 1st Company ran forward with a magnetic mine. He reached the tank and slapped the mine against its side armor. The tank's machine gun killed him before he could retreat. The mine detonated 5 seconds later. The explosion was massive, blowing off the tank's left track and starting a fire in the engine compartment. The crew bailed out. German infantry shot them as they emerged. Without the tank, the Soviet attack lost momentum. Their infantry tried to press forward, but German machine guns cut them down. Bodies piled in the approaches. The survivors retreated, dragging their wounded when they could. We had held the station. For now. The pattern repeated through the afternoon. Soviet probes, German defensive fire, brief savage exchanges that left men dead and accomplished nothing strategic. We bled for meters of rubble while the city burned around us. At 1600 hours, a Soviet mortar barrage hit the western platform. Shells walked across the concrete, detonating with sharp cracks that sent fragments flying in every direction. Men screamed. Some died instantly. Others bled out while we tried to apply tourniquets with trembling hands. By evening, the Soviet attacks intensified. Fresh troops had arrived. We could tell by their aggression and the volume of fire. They launched coordinated assaults from multiple directions, north, east, west. They probed for weaknesses while we tried to plug gaps with diminishing numbers. Every casualty weakened our position. Every death meant one less rifle to hold the line. The Soviets brought up more heavy weapons. A Maxim machine gun began firing from a building 200 meters north, raking the platforms with overlapping fields of fire. We could not suppress it. Our own machine guns had been destroyed or abandoned during the afternoon fighting. Individual riflemen could not generate enough volume of fire to force the Soviet crew into cover. They fired with impunity, methodically sweeping the station from left to right, then right to left, searching for targets. Gefreiter Zimmermann from 2nd Squad was hit while moving between positions. The machine gun round struck him across the torso, spinning him around before he collapsed. He lay in the open for 20 minutes, crying for help, begging for someone to pull him to cover. Nobody moved. To expose yourself meant joining him in death. Eventually his cries weakened, then stopped. He died alone in the rubble while we listened from positions 10 meters away. The ammunition situation became critical as evening progressed. We had fired thousands of rounds during the day's fighting. Resupply had not arrived. Each man rationed his remaining ammunition, firing only when targets presented themselves clearly. We conserved grenades. We prepared to fight with bayonets and entrenching tools if the Soviets overran our positions. Some men had pistols. Most of us did not. A rifle without ammunition was a club. That was how we would fight if it came to that. Koch was killed during the evening assault. A Soviet soldier shot him through the head while he was reloading. He fell forward without a sound, his rifle clattering to the concrete. I was alone, the last man from my squad. I picked up Koch's ammunition and continued firing, because there was nothing else to do. I scavenged equipment from the dead, ammunition pouches, grenades, a canteen half full of water. I took Koch's identification tags, but left his body where it lay. There was no time for burial, no energy for ceremony. The dead remained where they fell, until someone pushed them aside to clear a firing position, or until they began to decompose enough that the smell became intolerable. The temperature dropped after sunset. September nights in Stalingrad were cold enough to make you shiver, especially when exhaustion and hunger had depleted your body's resources. We had no winter clothing yet, no heavy coats or gloves. We wore what we had marched in, uniforms now torn and filthy, soaked with sweat and blood and the grey dust that permeated everything. Some men had blankets scavenged from Soviet positions. I did not. I pressed myself against concrete and tried to conserve body heat while my teeth chattered uncontrollably. Hunger was a constant companion. We had eaten nothing substantial since the cold rations at midday. Field kitchens were kilometers behind the front lines, unable to move forward through streets controlled by Soviet snipers and artillery. Some men had hoarded crackers or hard bread. I had nothing. My stomach cramped and complained, but I ignored it. Hunger was preferable to the alternative of being dead. Water was more critical than food. We had been fighting for 16 hours in September heat. We had sweated through our uniforms. We had breathed dust and smoke until our throats felt like sandpaper. The water situation was desperate. My canteen was empty. Koch's canteen had provided 2 swallows before running dry. I saw men drinking from puddles in the rubble, contaminated water that would certainly cause disease. Better dysentery tomorrow than death from dehydration tonight. That was the calculation. Night fell. The attacks slackened but did not stop. Soviet snipers fired at any movement. Soviet patrols infiltrated the rubble, trying to establish positions for the next day's assault. We fired flares into the darkness, illuminating frozen snapshots of the battlefield. Shadows moving between ruins, bodies scattered across open ground, the burned-out tank sitting like a monument to futility. The flares created their own problems. They revealed our positions as clearly as they revealed Soviet movement. We learned to fire flares only when absolutely necessary, when sounds in the darkness suggested an imminent attack. The rest of the time, we sat in complete blackness, listening to the sounds of war around us. Distant artillery, small arms fire from other sectors, the groan of collapsing buildings. Occasionally we heard voices, Soviet soldiers calling to each other in Russian, sometimes close enough that we could have thrown grenades at the sound. We remained silent. Revealing our positions invited mortar fire or a coordinated assault. Sleep was impossible despite the exhaustion. I had been awake for more than 30 hours. My body demanded rest, but my mind refused to quiet. Every sound triggered alertness. Every shadow became an enemy soldier. I sat with my rifle across my knees, finger near the trigger, eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours compressed into moments. I existed in a state of suspended terror, waiting for dawn or death, whichever arrived first. Around midnight, Soviet artillery opened fire on the station. The bombardment was not the massive preparatory fire we had experienced at dawn. This was harassment fire, designed to prevent rest and inflict random casualties. Shells arrived at irregular intervals, detonating across the platforms and in the rail yards. You could not predict the next impact. You could not take effective cover because you did not know where the next shell would land. You sat in your position and hoped the mathematical probability of survival remained in your favor. A shell detonated 30 meters from my position, close enough that the blast wave knocked me backward. Fragments whistled overhead. Dust and debris rained down. When the ringing in my ears subsided enough to hear, I detected screaming from somewhere in the darkness. A man had been hit. His cries were awful, not words, just raw sounds of agony. The screaming continued for perhaps 5 minutes. Then it stopped abruptly. Nobody went to help. We had no medical supplies. We could offer nothing except the knowledge that someone would likely join him soon. I found a corner of the main building and collapsed. My body screamed for sleep, but my mind refused to quiet. I had been awake for 36 hours. I had killed men. I had watched friends die. I had survived when better soldiers had not. There was no logic to it, no justice, just random chance and the thin margin between living and dying. The corner I occupied had been a ticket office before the war. Fragments of furniture remained, a metal filing cabinet riddled with bullet holes, a desk crushed beneath fallen concrete, papers scattered across the floor, now illegible from exposure and dirt. Someone had died in this room. The bloodstain was visible even in darkness, a darker patch against grey concrete. I sat with my back against the wall where the dead man had likely sat. His blood had dried, but the memory of his death remained imprinted in the space. I thought about Steiner, about his hands shaking as he lit cigarettes the night before the attack, about the grenade that ended him so suddenly that I never saw his body afterward, only the blood and scattered equipment marking where he had stood. I thought about Koch, shot through the head while reloading, about Holzer choking on his own blood, about Baumann staring at his intestines spilling from his open stomach, about all the others whose names I knew and whose deaths I had witnessed or heard about secondhand. The guilt of survival was irrational but inescapable. Why had I lived when they died? What made me special? Nothing. I was not braver, not more skilled, not more deserving. I simply happened to be standing in places where bullets and fragments did not arrive. They happened to be standing in places where death found them. The randomness was terrifying. It meant that courage and competence mattered less than pure chance. It meant that everything we had been taught about being good soldiers was partially a lie. You could do everything correctly and still die. You could make mistakes and still survive. The battlefield did not care about merit. Around 0200 hours, activity in the Soviet positions increased. We heard vehicles moving, voices calling orders, the sounds of troops maneuvering into assault positions. An attack was coming. We roused anyone who had managed to find sleep. We checked weapons and ammunition. We prepared as best we could with depleted resources and exhausted bodies. At 0300 hours on the 15th, the Soviets launched their major counterattack. Artillery preparation, heavy mortars, then infantry in strength. They came in waves, dozens of soldiers advancing through the rubble with fixed bayonets and grenades. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places. Men grappled in the darkness, stabbing with knives and entrenching tools. The station became a slaughterhouse. We held the western platform for 2 hours. Then Soviet infantry overwhelmed 1st Squad's position on the northern end. They poured through the breach, rolling up our defensive line. Hauptmann Fischer ordered a withdrawal to the rail yards. We fell back in the darkness, carrying our wounded when we could, leaving the dead where they lay. The Soviets occupied the platforms we had taken 12 hours earlier. We had paid in blood for ground we could not hold. The withdrawal was chaos, units fragmented in the darkness. Men became separated from their squads. Soviet soldiers pursued aggressively, firing into the retreating Germans. We returned fire as we moved, not aiming, just pointing weapons toward muzzle flashes and pulling triggers. The night was filled with noise, screaming, explosions, the crack of rifles and the heavier sound of machine guns. Language became meaningless. Everyone shouted, but nobody communicated. I stumbled over a body in the darkness. It grabbed my ankle, not a corpse, but a wounded soldier, German. I could tell from the uniform. He begged me to help him. His legs were destroyed, both of them shattered by an explosion. He could not walk. He could not crawl. He needed to be carried or he would be captured or killed. I looked at him. I looked at the Soviet muzzle flashes growing closer. I pulled my ankle free and kept moving. He screamed after me, cursing, begging, threatening. I ignored him. Survival was individual. Heroism was suicide. I chose to live. We established a defensive line in the rail yards, using wrecked train cars and piles of railroad ties as cover. Soviet pursuit stopped at the platform's edge. They had retaken their objective. They did not waste men pursuing into darkness where German soldiers could be anywhere. The shooting diminished. The night returned to its previous state of tense, violent waiting. By dawn on the 15th, 2nd Battalion held only the rail yards and a few buildings south of the station. The main station building was Soviet-controlled. The platforms were Soviet-controlled. We had lost railway station number 1. Hauptmann Fischer gathered what remained of the company. We were 47 men. We had started the attack with 138. Fischer looked like death. His face was grey with fatigue and blood loss. The bandage on his arm was soaked through, brown with dried blood and fresh red blood seeping through. He should have been evacuated. He refused. Officers who evacuated for wounds were often replaced. He wanted to stay with the company. This loyalty would kill him within hours. But at that moment it meant everything to those of us who remained. He told us that 1st Battalion was moving up to reinforce us. Together, we would retake the station. He did not mention that 1st Battalion was probably as depleted as we were, that the reinforcements would likely consist of 200 exhausted men being thrown against Soviet defenders who now occupied fortified positions. He did not need to mention it. We understood the pattern. The battalion commander ordered another attack for 0900 hours. Fresh troops from 1st Battalion would support us. We would retake the station. The orders were clear. The implementation was predictable. More men would die for rubble that would change hands again by evening. We had 3 hours to prepare. We redistributed ammunition from the dead. We gathered grenades. We found water, finally, brought forward by runners who had survived the gauntlet of Soviet sniper fire. The water was warm and tasted of metal from the canteens, but it was water. We drank greedily, our bodies desperate for hydration after a day and night of combat. Food arrived as well, bread, tins of meat. We ate mechanically, forcing food into stomachs that had shrunk from hunger and stress. Some men vomited immediately. Their bodies could not process solid food after so long without it. Others kept it down through force of will. We needed the calories. We needed the strength. Whether our bodies accepted the food or not, we had to try. A medical orderly moved through the positions, treating minor wounds. He had bandages, but no morphine, no sulfur powder, no proper medical supplies. He cleaned wounds with water and wrapped them with cloth bandages that would be filthy within an hour. Men with serious wounds, stomach wounds, sucking chest wounds, were beyond his help. They lay in the shade of wrecked train cars, slowly dying, occasionally calling for water or their mothers. We gave them water when we could spare it. We could not give them their mothers or salvation or anything that mattered. The second assault on the 15th followed the same pattern as the first. Artillery, air support, infantry assault into machine gun fire. We fought our way back onto the western platform by midday. The cost was devastating. Hauptmann Fischer died leading a charge across open ground. An Obergefreiter named Werner took command. He lasted 30 minutes before a Soviet grenade ended him. Leadership devolved to whoever survived longest. Fischer died stupidly. Bravely perhaps, but stupidly. He rose from cover and ran forward, waving his pistol, shouting for the company to follow. A Soviet machine gun cut him down before he made 10 meters. His body jerked as rounds struck him across the chest and abdomen. He fell face forward into the rubble. Some men followed his charge. Half of them died before reaching the platform. The other half made it to cover and continued fighting. Fischer's death accomplished nothing tactical. It provided an example of leadership. Whether that example was valuable or merely wasteful depended on perspective. Werner was more cautious. He kept low. He directed fire. He moved squads to exploit weaknesses in the Soviet defense. For 30 minutes, he was an effective leader. Then a Soviet soldier threw a grenade that landed in the shell crater Werner was using as a command post. The grenade detonated. Werner and 2 other men died instantly. A 4th man lost his right arm below the elbow. He stared at the stump in shock while blood jetted from the severed artery. Someone applied a tourniquet. The man went into shock and died 20 minutes later, despite the tourniquet. I found myself in command of nothing. My squad was dead. My platoon was scattered. I attached myself to a group of 5 soldiers from 1st Battalion and continued fighting because that was all there was to do. We advanced meter by meter across the platform, clearing the same rooms we had cleared the day before. The bodies from yesterday were still there, bloated and stinking in the September heat. We added fresh corpses to the collection. By 1500 hours on the 15th, we had retaken most of the station. The Soviets withdrew to prepared positions in the surrounding buildings. They would counterattack again that night. The cycle would continue. Attack, counterattack. Casualties mounting on both sides, while the strategic situation remained unchanged. I counted the men visible from my position, 23. 3rd Company had fielded 138 men 36 hours ago. I could see 23. Some were certainly scattered in other positions. Some were wounded and evacuated. Most were dead. The mathematics of attrition were simple and brutal. Another day of fighting like this would eliminate the company entirely. The ammunition situation had improved slightly. We had resupplied from casualties and from a delivery that somehow reached us during the midday lull. Each man now had perhaps 40 rounds and 2 or 3 grenades, enough to fight for a few hours. Not enough for sustained combat. The water situation remained critical. The food situation was unchanged. We had eaten once in 48 hours. Hunger gnawed constantly, but we had adapted to it. The body learned to function on minimal calories when survival demanded it. I spent the night of the 15th in the same corner of the main building where I'd rested 24 hours earlier. The building had changed hands twice. Bodies lay in rooms we had cleared multiple times. Some were German, some were Soviet. Most were unidentifiable, burned or dismembered by explosives. The smell was unbearable. Death and decay in concentrated form. The bodies had begun to decompose in the September heat. Faces turned black. Flesh swelled and split. Gases escaped with sounds that mimicked breathing or groaning. It was easy, in darkness, to mistake a dead man for a living one. Easy to aim your rifle at a corpse that seemed to move. The mind played tricks when exhausted. Reality became unreliable. I tried to sleep. My body demanded it. I had been awake, truly awake, for more than 50 hours. Combat sleep did not count. Those moments of semi-consciousness where you existed in a state between waking and sleeping, never truly resting, always half alert for danger. Real sleep required safety. There was no safety in Stalingrad, so I lay against the wall and closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of war around me and tried to convince my body that this was rest. On the 16th, Soviet artillery targeted the station continuously. Shells fell throughout the day, grinding down our positions and our numbers. We could not resupply. Ammunition ran low. Water ran out. Men drank from puddles and accepted the consequences. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded lay in cellars, groaning until they died or until morphine silenced them. The artillery began at dawn. Heavy guns, probably 122mm howitzers, firing from positions across the Volga or from the northern suburbs. The shells arrived with a freight train sound, a rising whistle that terminated in detonations that shook the rubble. The bombardment was systematic. The Soviets walked shells across the station, covering every meter of ground, destroying any position that might harbor German troops. We huddled in whatever cover we could find, cellars, craters, the wreckage of train cars, anywhere that provided overhead protection. Direct hits were unsurvivable. Near misses killed through blast, overpressure, or fragments. The fragments were worst. Shell casings burst into hundreds of pieces of jagged metal that flew in every direction. Men were shredded by fragments they never saw coming. You heard the shell detonate, and then you checked yourself for wounds, because the shock of impact often prevented immediate pain. Sometimes you found blood. Sometimes you found nothing. Sometimes the man next to you was dead, and you were untouched, separated by a meter and infinite luck. The bombardment continued for hours. We could not move. We could not fight back. We could only endure. Some men broke. The psychological pressure of sustained shelling exceeded their capacity to cope. They curled into fetal positions and whimpered. They cried for mothers who were thousands of kilometers away. They prayed to gods they had not believed in before Stalingrad. Some men remained silent, their minds retreating to places where shells did not fall and friends did not die. Their bodies continued to function, but their consciousness had fled. I remained functional through force of will and perhaps through emotional numbness. I had seen too much death. I had exceeded my capacity for fear. The shells fell and I waited for the one with my name on it. It had not arrived yet. Maybe it would, maybe it would not. The outcome was beyond my control. This acceptance was liberating in its way. If I could not control whether I lived or died, then worrying about it was pointless. I existed in the moment and dealt with immediate problems and did not think about the future because the future might not exist. Around midday, the artillery shifted to mortar fire. Smaller caliber but more accurate, the mortar crews could see their impacts and adjust fire accordingly. Shells landed in positions we had thought were protected. Cellars received plunging fire that penetrated overhead cover. The casualty rate increased, the screaming increased. The requests for medics went unanswered because there were no medics, or because the medics were dead, or because the wounded were beyond help. A mortar shell detonated in the entrance of the cellar where I had taken cover. The blast channeled down the stairs, creating an overpressure wave that felt like being struck by a truck. My ears bled. My nose bled. I could not hear anything except ringing. 3 men who had been near the entrance were dead, their bodies torn apart by the confined explosion. The rest of us were wounded in varying degrees, fragments embedded in flesh, bleeding from ears and noses, concussed and disoriented. I climbed the stairs and emerged into daylight. The world was silent except for the ringing in my ears. Shells continued to fall, but I could not hear them. I saw the detonations, saw the smoke and debris fountaining upward, saw men thrown by blasts. But all of it happened in eerie silence, as though I was watching a film with no sound. The disconnection was surreal and terrifying. Hearing provided warning. Without it, shells appeared randomly, detonating without warning, killing without sound. The Soviet counterattack on the 16th came at dusk. This time they brought armor, 3 tanks supported by infantry. They advanced methodically, firing into every position while infantry cleared rooms behind them. We had no anti-tank weapons. The magnetic mines were expended. We threw grenades that accomplished nothing against armored steel. We withdrew again, this time to positions 300 meters south of the station. The tanks were T-34s, fast and well armored. They moved through the rubble with surprising agility, crushing obstacles and firing their 76mm main guns at point-blank range. The first tank destroyed what remained of the western platform building, bringing down walls and roof supports with methodical fire. German soldiers tried to run. The tank's machine gun killed them. Those who stayed in cover were buried by collapsing structures or burned alive when fuel tanks in the wreckage ignited. The second tank engaged positions in the rail yards. It fired high-explosive shells that detonated against train cars and piles of railroad ties, sending fragments and splinters through anyone nearby. A squad from 1st Battalion tried to flank the tank. Soviet infantry spotted them and opened fire. 3 Germans died immediately. The others retreated, dragging 1 wounded man. The tank swiveled its turret and fired a shell that detonated among them. Nobody survived. The 3rd tank advanced directly toward my position. I pressed myself into rubble and tried to be invisible. The tank passed within 10 meters, close enough that I could smell the diesel exhaust and see the rust on its armor. Soviet infantry followed behind it, using the tank as mobile cover. They fired at anything that moved. I remained motionless. The tank passed, the infantry passed. I was alive through sheer luck and the enemy's focus on more obvious threats. We withdrew in disorder, units mixed together. Germans from different companies and battalions retreated in the same direction, away from the tanks and infantry, seeking any position that might provide temporary safety. Officers tried to organize the retreat, but communication was impossible in the chaos. We fell back 300 meters and established a new defensive line using whatever cover we could find. The station was lost again. The tanks stopped at the station's perimeter. They had achieved their objective. They did not pursue further. By the 17th, what remained of 2nd Battalion had been pulled from the line. We were combat ineffective. 3rd Company numbered 18 men from an original strength of 138. The other companies had suffered proportionally. We marched to the rear, past fresh troops moving forward to continue the battle. They looked at us with expressions we could not read. Pity, fear, relief that they were not us. Yet, the march to the rear was difficult despite the short distance. We were exhausted beyond anything training had prepared us for. Our bodies had been pushed past normal limits. Some men could barely walk. We supported each other, wounded helping wounded, the slightly injured assisting those more seriously hurt. We moved slowly through rubble and destroyed streets, always aware that Soviet artillery could target us at any moment. The fresh troops we passed were from the 295th Infantry Division. They looked clean. Their uniforms were intact. They carried full equipment. They had not yet learned what Stalingrad would teach them. They stared at us as we passed. We were filthy, blood-stained, gaunt from hunger and lack of sleep. We moved like old men, though most of us were in our 20s. We did not speak to them. There was nothing to say. They would learn. One of the replacements, a young Gefreiter who looked perhaps 19 years old, asked me what it was like at the station. I looked at him. I tried to find words. I could not. What could I say that would mean anything? That it was hell? That death was random? That courage mattered less than luck? Any description would fall short of reality. He would have to experience it himself to understand. So I said nothing. I walked past him and continued toward the rear. We reached a collection point in a half-destroyed factory building 2 kilometers south of the station. Medical personnel triaged the wounded. Those with serious injuries were evacuated to field hospitals farther behind the lines. Those with minor wounds were treated and returned to duty. The line between serious and minor was arbitrary and cruel. A shattered leg meant evacuation. A fragment wound that had not struck vital organs meant bandaging and retention with the unit. Men begged to be evacuated. Men with wounds that would kill them in days or weeks were sent back to fight because the wound did not immediately incapacitate them. I was examined by a medical officer. He found fragment wounds in my left shoulder and right thigh. Neither was serious. The fragments had not struck bone. The bleeding had stopped. He cleaned the wounds with water and wrapped them with bandages and declared me fit for duty. I asked about evacuation. He laughed, not cruelly but with exhaustion and grim humor. Every man asked about evacuation. Every man wanted out of Stalingrad. Only the dying and the lucky received that gift. I was neither. I returned to what remained of 3rd Company. Railway Station number 1 remained contested. Other units would fight for it, die for it, take it and lose it repeatedly over the coming weeks. The station had no strategic value beyond its existence as a point on a map. But maps meant nothing in Stalingrad. Only survival mattered, and survival was mostly luck. We rested for 3 days in the factory building. Rest meaning we were not actively being shot at. We still endured artillery fire. Soviet bombers still struck targets throughout the German-held portions of the city. Random death still found men. But compared to the station, this was rest. We slept. We ate hot food from a field kitchen that somehow continued to function. We cleaned our weapons. We wrote letters that might never be delivered. We existed in a temporary state where the future extended days rather than hours. Third Company was reconstituted with replacements in early October. New faces, young soldiers fresh from training. They asked questions about the fighting. We did not answer. There were no words that could convey what the station had been, what Stalingrad was. They would learn soon enough. The replacements were sent to us from training depots in Germany. Most had completed basic infantry training but had no combat experience. They had drilled on parade grounds and training ranges. They had never seen a man die. They had never killed anyone. They arrived in Stalingrad expecting war, as they had been taught it existed, with clear objectives and organized operations and battles that could be won. Stalingrad would disabuse them of these notions quickly and brutally. I tried to help some of them. I explained basic survival tactics. Keep your head down. Do not volunteer. Do not be the first or the last in line. Stay close to veterans who had survived thus far. Scavenge everything. Trust nothing. The lessons seemed inadequate even as I spoke them. How do you teach someone to survive randomness? How do you explain that doing everything correctly could still result in death, while doing everything wrong might result in survival? I gave them what knowledge I could and hoped it would help. For some it would, for others it would not matter. Stalingrad killed indiscriminately. I never returned to railway station number 1. My war in Stalingrad ended in November, when a shell fragment opened my thigh and shattered the femur. I was evacuated across the Volga by night, carried on a stretcher through frozen ruins, while Soviet artillery searched for crossing points. I survived. Most of Third Company did not. The wound happened during an attack on a factory complex whose name I never learned. We were assaulting a building held by Soviet Marines when an artillery barrage caught us in the open. I do not remember the impact. I remember being on the ground with my leg opened from hip to knee, bone protruding through flesh, blood soaking into the frozen earth. I remember screaming. I remember a medic applying a tourniquet. I remember being carried to a collection point. After that, morphine erased the details. I spent 3 days at a field hospital before being evacuated by air to a hospital in Germany. The femur was shattered in multiple places. Surgeons removed fragments of bone and metal and stitched the leg back together as best they could. I spent 6 months in hospital beds, learning to walk again. The leg healed crooked. I walked with a limp for the rest of my life. But I walked. I was alive. Thousands who fought at Stalingrad were not. The final casualty figures for 2nd Battalion during the fighting for railway station number 1 were never compiled officially. Records were lost, units were scattered, men disappeared. Based on what I witnessed and what I learned later, 2nd Battalion suffered approximately 80% casualties between the 14th and 17th of September. 3rd Company lost 120 men killed, wounded, or missing from a strength of 138. I knew the names of those who died: Steiner, Holzer, Baumann, Koch, Hartmann, Schmidt, Werner, Fischer, Zimmermann, dozens more whose faces I remember but whose names have faded. Steiner was 24, from Bavaria. He had a wife and a daughter he had never seen. The daughter was born while he was in France. He carried a photograph of his wife holding the baby. He showed it to anyone who would look. The photograph was in his breast pocket when the grenade killed him. I wonder if it survived. I wonder if his wife ever learned exactly how he died, or if she received only the standard notification that her husband had fallen for the fatherland. Holzer was 19, from a farm in Saxony. He had enlisted because his father told him it was his duty. He had not wanted to be a soldier. He had wanted to work the farm and marry the girl from the neighboring farm and live a simple life. War took him from that future and gave him a throat wound that drowned him in his own blood in a corridor in Stalingrad. He died trying to speak, trying to say something important, but only blood came out. Baumann was 28, the oldest man in the squad. He had been a teacher before the war. He talked about returning to teaching when the war ended. He talked about the books he would assign his students and the lessons he would teach about history and literature. He died staring at his own intestines, his face expressing not pain, but bewilderment, as though he could not understand how the world had betrayed him so completely. Koch had been a mechanic, quiet, competent, good with his hands. He could repair anything, rifles, vehicles, equipment. He was valuable because of these skills. Being valuable did not save him. A bullet through the head while reloading, instant death. No final words, no last thoughts. Just existence terminated in a fraction of a second. Fischer had been a good officer, better than most. He cared about his men. He tried to minimize casualties when possible. He led from the front when necessary. His death was wasteful. A pistol-waving charge that accomplished nothing, but he died believing he was doing his duty. Perhaps that mattered. Perhaps it made his death more bearable for those who survived. I do not know. I only know that we missed him after he was gone. Werner was less competent. The company suffered for it. The battle for Railway Station No. 1 was a microcosm of Stalingrad. Brutal, futile, measured in corpses rather than territory. We took the station and lost it, and took it again, paying each time with blood while accomplishing nothing that mattered strategically. The Soviets fed in reinforcements, we fed in replacements. The city consumed both sides without discrimination. I learned later that Railway Station No. 1 changed hands 15 times during September and October. Each exchange cost hundreds of casualties. By November, when the Soviet counteroffensive encircled the Sixth Army, the station had been reduced to rubble. German forces held ruins that provided no shelter and no strategic advantage. They held because orders demanded it, not because holding served any purpose. Stalingrad destroyed the division, the regiment, the battalion, the company. Most of all, it destroyed the men who fought there. Those who survived carried wounds that did not show on medical charts. We had seen things that could not be unseen, done things that could not be undone. We returned to Germany as different men than we had been, hollow in ways that never healed. I think about Railway Station No. 1 sometimes, the platform where Steiner died, the corridor where Holzer bled out, the corner where I spent 2 nights waiting to die. These places mean nothing now. The station was rebuilt after the war. New platforms, new buildings. No trace remains of what happened there in September 1942. History moved on. The world forgot. But I remember. The survivors remember. We carried Railway Station No. 1 with us for the rest of our lives, a weight that never lightened. We paid for those meters of concrete and steel with the lives of better men than ourselves. That is the truth of Stalingrad. Not glory, not victory, just survival purchased at a cost that can never be repaid.